The sound that preceded death. February 14, 1943. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The Solomon Islands. Major William E. Giese stood on the crushed coral runway and watched his pilots climb into their new fighters for the first combat mission. 12 F4U Corsairs of VMF-124 were about to escort a formation of consolidated B-24 Liberators on a raid against the Japanese aerodrome at Kahili. The Marines had been flying the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, a reliable but outmatched fighter that struggled against the Mitsubishi A6M Zero's maneuverability. Now they had something different, something faster, something deadlier. The Corsair sat on its landing gear like a predator at rest. The inverted gull wing gave it an unmistakable profile. The massive 13-foot 4-inch propeller, driven by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine producing 2,000 horsepower, dominated the nose. This was not a defensive fighter. This was an offensive weapon, designed to hunt and kill. The mission proceeded according to plan until the bombers reached Kahili. Then Japanese fighters rose to meet them. Zeros, perhaps 24 of them, climbing rapidly, positioning themselves for slashing attacks on the bomber formation. The American escort fighters, Corsairs, P-40s, P-38s, moved to engage. What followed was chaos. The Americans got the worst of it. 4 P-38s went down, 2 P-40s, 2 Corsairs, 2 Liberators. Japanese losses were minimal, no more than 4 Zeros destroyed. The engagement would later be called the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. For the Corsair, it was an inauspicious debut. But something had changed in that engagement, something the Japanese pilots reported back to their intelligence officers at Rabaul. There was a new American fighter in the sky. It was fast, faster than anything they had encountered. When it dived, it accelerated to speeds that made interception nearly impossible. When it climbed, it maintained energy in ways that defied the performance envelope of the Zero. The reports were fragmentary, confused, written by men who had survived combat by instinct rather than analysis. But the core message was consistent. The Americans had deployed something new, something dangerous. At Rabaul, intelligence officers studied the reports. They cross-referenced them with reconnaissance photographs, with radio intercepts, with every scrap of information they could gather. The aircraft was designated F-6F by some observers, a misidentification that would persist for weeks. Others called it simply the new Blue Fighter. The confusion was understandable. The Corsair shared design lineage with other American fighters, all powered by variants of the same R2800 engine. But the performance was different. The speed was different. Everything about the tactical employment was different. Within days, the Japanese had given the aircraft a name: Whistling Death. The designation came from the sound the Corsair made in a high-speed dive. A banshee wail created by air rushing through the oil cooler intakes in the wing roots. It was a sound that Japanese ground troops on Guadalcanal and New Georgia would come to recognize instantly. When they heard that whistle, death was seconds away. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. A weapon that announces its arrival with a distinctive sound becomes more than a weapon. It becomes a presence, an inevitability. The Corsair had not been designed with psychological warfare in mind. It had been designed to extract maximum performance from the most powerful engine available. In February 1938, the U.S. Navy Bureau of Aeronautics had issued a request for proposals for a new single-engine fighter. The requirements were simple: maximum obtainable speed, minimum stalling speed not higher than 70 miles per hour, and a range of 1,000 miles. The fighter had to carry 4 guns, or 3 with increased ammunition. Rex Beisel, leading the design team at Chance Vote, had responded with the V-166B. The first flight of the F4U-1 prototype occurred on May 29, 1940. On October 1st of that year, the prototype became the first single-engine U.S. fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour, achieving an average ground speed of 405 miles per hour from Stratford to Hartford. The achievement was remarkable. The aircraft represented a leap forward in fighter design, incorporating advances in aerodynamics, engine performance, and structural engineering that would define American fighter development for the next decade. But getting the Corsair into production proved difficult. Carrier suitability was a major issue. The long nose obstructed forward visibility during landing approaches. The aircraft tended to bounce on the deck due to problematic oleostruts. The left wing had a tendency to stall without warning during slow-speed approaches, a potentially lethal characteristic that could flip the aircraft inverted if the throttle were suddenly advanced. These problems delayed carrier deployment and led to the Corsair being assigned initially to land-based Marine squadrons. The Navy, seeking to standardize on a single carrier fighter, selected the more docile Grumman F-6F Hellcat instead. For the Marines, the Corsair's carrier deficiencies were irrelevant. They operated from land bases. They needed firepower and speed, not ease of carrier operations. When VMF 100 C-224 Forties received its Corsairs in January 1943, the squadron began an intensive training program to master the new aircraft. The pilots learned quickly that the Corsair demanded respect. The massive engine produced enormous torque during takeoff. An inexperienced pilot who advanced the throttle too aggressively could find his aircraft flipping onto its back, a characteristic that earned the Corsair the nickname Ensign Eliminator among Navy pilots. But for those who mastered it, the Corsair was a revelation. Lieutenant Kenneth A. Walsh, a pilot with VMF 124, would become the first Corsair ace. In later years, he would recall the aircraft's capabilities with precision. "I learned quickly that altitude was paramount," he said. "Whoever had altitude dictated the terms of the battle, and there was nothing a Zero pilot could do to change that. We had him. The F4U could outperform a Zero in every aspect except slow speed maneuverability and slow speed rate of climb. Therefore, you avoided getting slow when combating a Zero." This was the revelation that would transform the air war in the Pacific. The Corsair did not need to outturn the Zero. It needed to outclimb it, outdive it, and outrun it. American pilots developed tactics that exploited these advantages ruthlessly. They would climb to altitude, position themselves above Japanese formations, and then dive at speeds that made interception impossible. The Corsair's 650 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, 3 mounted in each outer wing panel, could destroy a Zero with a single burst. The engagement was over before the Japanese pilot could react. By May 1943, the tide was turning. VMF 124 was getting the upper hand in engagements over the Solomon Islands. Walsh was racking up victories. Other Corsair squadrons were deploying to the theater. The Japanese, who had dominated the air war in the Pacific for 18 months, were suddenly on the defensive. The mathematics of the engagement had changed. When the Corsair arrived, the equation shifted from Japanese advantage to American superiority. The industrial capacity of the United States was beginning to manifest itself in the skies over the Pacific. The Doctrine of Speed. March 1943. Rabaul, New Britain. Japanese Naval Air Force Headquarters. Intelligence officers compiled reports from returning pilots with growing unease. The pattern was unmistakable. American fighter tactics had changed. Where American pilots had previously engaged in turning dogfights, engagements that favored the Zero's superior maneuverability, they were now employing hit-and-run tactics, high-speed diving attacks, slashing passes, refusal to engage at slow speeds. The tactics were devastatingly effective. The reports described aircraft losses in detail. Zeros destroyed in flames before the pilot could react. Bomber formations torn apart by coordinated attacks from multiple directions. Escort missions that failed because the American fighters simply outran the Japanese interceptors. The losses were mounting. More concerning was the morale impact. Japanese pilots, trained in the art of the dogfight, found themselves unable to bring their skills to bear. The Americans refused to fight on Japanese terms. Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya, a Japanese naval aviator and staff officer, would later write about the impact of the Corsair on Japanese air operations. He noted that Japanese bomber missions to Guadalcanal, which had previously required a dozen escort fighters, now required 20 or 30. Even then, losses were heavy. The Corsair's speed advantage meant it could choose when and how to engage. Japanese pilots found themselves constantly on the defensive, trying to protect bombers while being picked apart by attacks they could not counter. The technical specifications explained part of the problem. The F4U Corsair, powered by the R2800 double Wasp engine, achieved a maximum speed of 417 miles per hour at 19,900 feet. The Mitsubishi A6M50, the latest variant in service in 1943, achieved a maximum speed of 351 miles per hour at 19,685 feet. The difference, 66 miles per hour, was insurmountable in combat. When a Corsair dived away from an engagement, no Zero could catch it. When a Corsair climbed to altitude, the Zero struggled to follow. Rate of climb told a similar story. The F4U could climb at 2,890 feet per minute at sea level. The Zero, despite its light weight, climbed at 3,100 feet per minute, a slight advantage that disappeared at altitude. Above 15,000 feet, the Corsair's mechanically supercharged engine maintained power while the Zero's engine lost performance. In engagements above 20,000 feet, the Corsair was dominant, but speed and climb rate were only part of the equation. The Corsair's armament was substantially heavier than the Zero's. 650 caliber machine guns, each loaded with 400 rounds for the inner pair and 375 rounds for the outer guns, gave the Corsair devastating firepower. A single burst could tear a Zero apart. The Zero's armament, 2 7.7mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannons, was lethal when it hit. But the lighter construction of the Zero meant it could not absorb damage the way the Corsair could. American pilots exploited this ruthlessly. Marine squadrons developed tactics that emphasized the Corsair's strengths. The Thatch Weave, originally developed for the F4F Wildcat, was adapted for the Corsair. Pairs of aircraft would weave back and forth, covering each other's tails, making it nearly impossible for a Japanese pilot to get a clean shot. When a Zero attempted to follow one Corsair into a turn, the wingman would be in position to attack. The tactics required discipline and coordination, but they were devastatingly effective. By March 1943, all 8 Marine fighter squadrons in the Solomons were converting to Corsairs. The transition represented a fundamental shift in American air doctrine. The defensive posture that had characterized the first year of the war was over. Now the Americans were hunting. Corsair patrols ranged across the Solomon Islands, seeking out Japanese aircraft, attacking Japanese airfields, interdicting supply lines. The Japanese, who had grown accustomed to air superiority, found themselves operating in contested airspace. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was profound. In post-war interrogations, Japanese aviators described the fear that accompanied Corsair encounters. The sound of the whistle in a dive, the inability to evade once the Corsair committed to an attack, the knowledge that in any engagement at altitude, The Corsair pilot dictated the terms. This was psychological warfare of a particularly effective kind. A weapon that your opponent fears is twice as effective as a weapon that merely destroys. Japanese tactical doctrine began to shift in response. Bomber formations increased their escort ratios. Fighter patrols were ordered to maintain altitude advantage whenever possible. Pilots were cautioned to avoid diving after Corsairs, as the American fighters could simply outrun their pursuers. But these tactical adjustments could not overcome the fundamental performance disadvantage. The Zero had been designed for a different kind of war, a war of long-range bomber escorts and turning dogfights. The Corsair had been designed for speed, firepower, and the ability to dominate engagements through superior energy management. In the skies over the Solomon Islands, energy management was proving to be the decisive factor. The Industrial Mathematics. April 1943. Detroit, Michigan. The Fisher Tank Arsenal and surrounding industrial facilities were operating at full capacity. The production of the F4U Corsair, initially slow due to the complexity of the design, was accelerating. Chance Vaught's facility in Stratford, Connecticut, was producing approximately 1 Corsair per day. Goodyear Aircraft, manufacturing the FG-1 variant under license, was ramping up production. Brewster Aeronautical Corporation, contracted to produce the F-3A variant, was struggling with quality control but still contributing to overall production numbers. The production statistics revealed the scale of American industrial capacity. By the end of 1943, over 4,000 Corsairs of all variants would be produced. By the end of the war, production would exceed 12,500 aircraft. This was industrial warfare on a scale that Japan could not match. Japanese aircraft production for the entire war would total approximately 65,000 aircraft of all types. American production would exceed 300,000. The mathematics were inexorable. In the Pacific Theater, this industrial advantage was beginning to manifest itself in ways that Japanese commanders found deeply troubling. When a Corsair squadron suffered losses, replacement aircraft arrived within weeks. When pilots were lost, replacement pilots arrived with increasing levels of training and experience. The American training pipeline was producing pilots at rates that seemed impossible. By mid-1943, new Marine pilots arriving in the Solomon Islands had logged hundreds of hours in training aircraft before ever seeing combat. Japanese pilots, by contrast, were being rushed through abbreviated training programs to replace mounting losses. The quality differential was becoming as important as the quantity differential. An experienced American pilot in a Corsair was nearly invincible in combat against a newly trained Japanese pilot in a Zero. The mathematical outcome of such engagements was predictable. The kill ratio, the number of enemy aircraft destroyed per friendly aircraft lost, was moving decisively in favor of the Americans. By the end of 1943, Corsair squadrons were achieving kill ratios of 10-to-1 or better in some engagements. Lieutenant Walsh, who would eventually be credited with 21 victories, understood this dynamic clearly. Of my 21 victories, he recalled, 17 were against Zeros, and I lost 5 aircraft in combat. I was shot down 3 times, and I crashed one that plowed into the line back at base and wiped out another F4U. The candid acknowledgement of losses did not diminish the overall success. Walsh survived. Many of his opponents did not. That was the essential mathematics of air combat. Survival was victory. But the Corsair was more than a fighter. It was also proving to be an exceptional fighter-bomber. The aircraft could carry substantial ordnance loads, up to 4,000 pounds of bombs, or 8 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets. This capability transformed the Corsair from a pure air superiority fighter into a multi-role platform capable of ground attack, close air support, and interdiction missions. Marine squadrons exploited this versatility, using Corsairs to attack Japanese installations, supply depots, and shipping. Charles Lindbergh, serving as a civilian technical advisor for United Aircraft Corporation, flew combat missions in Corsairs during 1944 to evaluate the aircraft's capabilities in the attack role. He managed to get the F4U airborne with 2,000 pounds of bombs on the centerline rack and 1,000 pounds under each wing. In the course of such experiments, he performed strikes on Japanese positions during the battle for the Marshall Islands. The data gathered from these missions informed subsequent doctrine for fighter-bomber operations. The Japanese had no equivalent capability. The Zero could carry light bomb loads, but it lacked the structural strength and engine power to function effectively as a fighter-bomber. Japanese doctrine separated fighters from bombers, with each type optimized for its specific role. The American approach, building aircraft that could perform multiple roles, reflected a different industrial and tactical philosophy. When you can produce aircraft in unlimited quantities, versatility becomes more valuable than specialization. By June 1943, 6 months after the Corsairs' combat debut, the strategic situation in the Solomon Islands had shifted decisively. The Japanese were on the defensive. American forces were advancing up the island chain, capturing airfields, establishing bases, bringing the war closer to the Japanese home islands. The Corsair squadrons, operating from these newly captured bases, extended their range of operations. Rabaul, once a secure Japanese stronghold, was now within range of regular Corsair patrols. The mathematics of defeat were becoming clear to anyone who studied the production figures and loss rates. Japan was losing pilots and aircraft at rates it could not sustain. The United States was producing pilots and aircraft at rates that seemed limitless. The Corsair, with its 11-to-1 kill ratio, was the sharp edge of American air power. But it was the industrial capacity behind that edge. The factories in Connecticut and Michigan and Kansas, the training schools in Florida and California and Texas, the supply lines that stretched across the Pacific, that made victory inevitable. The revelation was not that the Corsair was a superior fighter. The revelation was that American industry could produce superior fighters in quantities that no enemy could match. The moment of recognition. August 1943. Vella La Vella, Solomon Islands. Major Gregory Boyington assumed command of VMF 214, a squadron that would become legendary as the Black Sheep Squadron. Boyington was not a conventional Marine officer. He had flown with the American Volunteer Group, the Flying Tigers, in China, where he had claimed 6 victories against Japanese aircraft. He was aggressive, unconventional, and utterly committed to destroying Japanese air power. He was also deeply skeptical of bureaucratic authority, a characteristic that would define his leadership style. VMF 214 received 27 F4U Corsairs and began operations in September. The squadron's area of operations was the slot, the body of water between the Solomon Islands where Japanese and American forces contested control. It was some of the most intense air combat of the Pacific War. Japanese bombers, escorted by fighters, attempted to attack American positions. American fighters rose to intercept. The engagements were frequent, violent, and decisive. Boyington's tactics exploited the Corsairs' capabilities without mercy. He led aggressive patrols deep into Japanese-controlled airspace, seeking combat rather than waiting for it. When contact was made, the Black Sheep attacked with overwhelming force. The Corsairs' speed allowed them to position for optimal attack angles. The firepower allowed them to destroy targets with single bursts. The tactics were simple. Get in fast, hit hard, get out before the enemy could react. In one 6-week period, VMF 214 was credited with destroying 94 Japanese aircraft. The number was staggering even allowing for the inevitable overclaiming that occurred in the confusion of combat. Boyington himself was credited with 22 victories in Corsairs, adding to his earlier 6 with the Flying Tigers for a total of 28. Whether the exact numbers were accurate mattered less than the psychological impact. The Japanese came to recognize the Black Sheep's distinctive markings. When those Corsairs appeared, Japanese formations broke up. Discipline evaporated. Each pilot fought for himself, seeking survival rather than victory. This was the moment of recognition for Japanese air commanders. They were not facing a superior aircraft. They were facing a superior system. The Corsair was merely the visible manifestation of American industrial and organizational superiority. Behind every Corsair in the sky were dozens more in production. Behind every pilot were dozens more in training. Behind every squadron were logistics chains that seemed infinite in their capacity to supply fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and replacements. Japanese production of the Zero peaked at over 800 aircraft per month in mid-1943. American production of the Corsair, Hellcat, and other fighters was approaching 3,000 aircraft per month. The disparity was overwhelming, and the quality gap was widening. New variants of the Corsair, the F4U-1A with a raised cockpit for better visibility, the F4U-1C with 4 20mm cannons instead of machine guns, the F4U-1D optimized for ground attack, were entering service with incremental improvements that accumulated into substantial advantages. Japanese aircraft development, by contrast, was stagnating. The Zero remained essentially unchanged from its 1941 configuration. Attempts to develop successor aircraft, the Kawanishi N1KJ Shiden, the Mitsubishi J2M Raiden, were hampered by material shortages, production difficulties, and the increasing chaos of the Japanese war economy. The few advanced aircraft that did reach service were too few to affect the strategic balance. Lieutenant Klingman of VMF 3112 would later demonstrate the Corsair's dominance in a way that became legendary. During a patrol over Okinawa, Klingman pursued a Japanese twin-engine aircraft to extreme altitude. At over 30,000 feet, the cold caused his guns to freeze. Unable to fire, Klingman made a decision that bordered on madness. He flew his Corsair into the Japanese aircraft and used his massive propeller to chop off the enemy's tail. The Corsair's propeller blades were shortened by 5 inches in the collision, but Klingman managed to land safely. He was awarded the Navy Cross. The incident, though unusual, illustrated a fundamental truth about the Corsair. It was a weapon of such overwhelming power and structural strength that it could destroy enemy aircraft even without firing its guns. The massive R-2800 engine, the heavy structure required for carrier operations, the enormous propeller, all of these characteristics that had made carrier operations difficult made the Corsair nearly indestructible in combat. It could absorb damage that would destroy other fighters. It could dish out punishment through firepower, through speed, through sheer physical force. By the end of 1943, the strategic situation in the Pacific had fundamentally changed. The Japanese, who had begun the war with air superiority, were now fighting desperately to contest control of the air. The Corsair squadrons, supported by growing numbers of Hellcats and other American fighters, were operating with increasing confidence. Japanese pilots spoke of the Corsair with fear. Ground troops dove for cover when they heard the whistle. The name Whistling Death was no longer just a designation. It was an acknowledgement of reality. The Americans had unleashed a weapon that the Japanese could not counter. The mathematics of industrial warfare were writing the conclusion to the Pacific Air War, and the Corsair was the instrument of that conclusion. The tide turns in the slot. September 1943. The Solomon Islands. The engagement occurred just before dawn, when the American patrol was moving to intercept a Japanese bomber formation returning from a night raid. 12 Corsairs of VMF 124 climbed to altitude, seeking the height advantage that every pilot understood was crucial. Kenneth Walsh was leading Red Flight that morning. He had logged 17 hours in the Corsair at that point, a modest amount of flight time, but enough to understand the aircraft's capabilities. The radio crackled with reports of Japanese bombers and fighters approaching from the northwest. Walsh turned his flight to intercept. The morning sky was clear. Visibility was unlimited. The conditions were ideal for air combat. Ahead, at about 23,000 feet, Walsh spotted the Japanese formation. Zeros, perhaps 20 of them, escorting twin-engine Mitsubishi G4M bombers. The Zeros were positioned above the bombers, ready to pounce on any American fighters that attempted to attack. Walsh made his decision instantly. He turned his flight toward the Zeros at full throttle, climbing hard. The F4U Corsairs, with their massive R-2800 engines operating at full military power, accelerated upward. The rate of climb was extraordinary. The Corsairs were eating altitude, gaining the position of advantage. The Japanese pilots saw the American fighters climbing toward them and attempted to turn into the attack. But the mathematics of energy management had already determined the outcome. Walsh and his wingmen reached sufficient altitude to dictate the terms of engagement. They dove on the Japanese formation from above, the sun at their backs. 6 50-caliber machine guns per aircraft filled the sky with tracers. A Zero caught the full burst from Walsh's guns and erupted in flames. Another Zero attempted to turn hard left and found itself engulfed in fire from a Corsair's wing guns. Within 30 seconds, 3 Japanese fighters were destroyed. The American pilots broke off and climbed back to altitude, regaining the height advantage. The maneuver was textbook perfect. The Japanese pilots, skilled and brave though they were, had been outmaneuvered by aircraft that could climb faster, dive faster, and accelerate faster than their own machines. The engagement continued for 15 minutes. By the time it ended, 7 Japanese Zeros had been destroyed. No American Corsairs had been lost. One Corsair took damage and limped home on a damaged engine, but the pilot managed to land safely. The bomber formation, deprived of adequate fighter escort, was forced to turn back. None of the bombers reached their target. The engagement would become known as one of Walsh's most significant victories, not because of the number of aircraft destroyed, but because it demonstrated with absolute clarity the Corsair's tactical superiority over the Zero in energy management combat. Word of the engagement spread through the Marine squadrons operating in the Solomon Islands. This was the moment when skepticism began to turn into confidence. The Corsair was not just a faster aircraft. It was a fundamentally superior fighting machine when employed correctly. American pilots began to understand the tactical principles that exploited the Corsair's advantages. They trained specifically for energy management engagements. They practiced climbing and diving in formation. They studied the performance curves of their aircraft and compared them mentally with the known performance of the Zero. By October 1943, every Marine fighter squadron in the Solomon Islands had received Corsairs. The conversion was complete. The age of the Wildcat was over. The age of the Corsair had begun. Japanese pilots, reporting back to their commands, spoke with growing desperation about the new American fighters. The engagements over the slot became progressively more dangerous for Japanese aviators. When Japanese bombers needed fighter escort, pilots began to volunteer reluctantly. Everyone understood what flying top cover for bombers meant. It meant waiting in the sky, maintaining altitude, and eventually being bounced by Corsairs diving from above. It meant fighting at a disadvantage. It meant, increasingly, dying. the Black Sheep Squadron Ascendant. November 1943. Vella La Vella Island. Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington had been in combat before. He had flown with the Flying Tigers in China, had seen combat with American pilots against Japanese aircraft, had already claimed 6 victories before transferring to the United States Marine Corps. He understood air combat from first principles. He understood that tactics dictated outcomes more than technology. He understood that aggressive leadership could compensate for inexperience. He understood that the Corsair was a weapon that demanded to be used aggressively. Boyington took command of a composite marine fighter squadron designated VMF 214. It was a squadron that had been characterized by some as undisciplined and difficult to manage. The pilots were experienced combat veterans, but they lacked cohesion. They flew well individually, but not as a team. Boyington set out to change that. He instituted a training program that emphasized aggressive tactics. He led patrol missions himself, demonstrating the tactics he was teaching. He personally shot down Japanese aircraft, proving that the tactics worked. He created a legend. The call sign for VMF 214 came from the markings that adorned the aircraft. They were painted in a distinctive scheme that some observers thought made the squadron look like sheep. Black sheep, to be specific. The Black Sheep Squadron. The name was slightly derisive, reflecting the squadron's reputation for aggressive flying and aggressive personalities. Boyington loved it. He embraced the identity. The Black Sheep became synonymous with aggressive air combat in the Pacific. When Japanese pilots saw those distinctive markings, they knew they were in for a fight. The tactics that Boyington and his pilots employed were ruthless. They would search for Japanese formations and attack with overwhelming numbers. When contact was made with a numerically inferior Japanese force, the Black Sheep would press the advantage. When outnumbered, they would use superior Corsair performance to disengage and attack again from a position of advantage. The goal was always the same: destroy the Japanese aircraft. Tactics evolved from mission to mission as Boyington and his pilots refined their understanding of how to fight the Corsair most effectively. In one 6-week period spanning November and December 1943, VMF 214 was credited with destroying 94 Japanese aircraft. The statistical claim may have included some overcounting. The fog of air combat makes precise claims difficult, but the core reality was indisputable. The Black Sheep Squadron was devastatingly effective. Boyington himself was credited with shooting down 22 aircraft in Corsairs, adding to his earlier 6 victories with the Flying Tigers for a total of 28. The impact on Japanese morale was substantial. When the Black Sheep appeared on the horizon, Japanese formations began to fragment. Pilots sought individual survival rather than maintaining formation integrity. The confidence that Japanese pilots had possessed in the early war years evaporated. They were no longer hunters. They had become prey. And the hunter, the Black Sheep Squadron, flying F4U Corsairs, was proving to be efficient and merciless. Boyington was awarded the Medal of Honor for his service with the Black Sheep Squadron. The decoration was later somewhat controversial, with critics arguing that his victory count had been inflated and that some of his aircraft had actually been shot down by anti-aircraft fire rather than in air combat. Regardless of the technical disputes, the essential truth remained unchanged. Boyington had led the Black Sheep Squadron with aggressive brilliance. The squadron had accumulated victories at a rate that demonstrated overwhelming superiority. The Corsair had proven to be the ideal platform for this aggressive doctrine. The Japanese Navy, recognizing the threat that the Corsair represented, began to concentrate its limited fighter resources on defending the most critical areas. The strategy was defensive and desperate. It conceded air superiority across most of the theater and accepted heavy losses in exchange for preventing American air attacks on the most strategically valuable installations. It was not a strategy born of optimism. It was a strategy born of desperation and the recognition of inferiority. The Whistle That Terrified. December 1943. The word whistle began to appear in Japanese military intelligence reports with increasing frequency. Ground troops reported hearing a distinctive whistling sound preceding American air attacks. Anti-aircraft positions reported hearing the whistle seconds before being strafed by machine gun fire. Pilots reported hearing the whistle in combat, with the sound having an almost supernatural quality that seemed to presage their own destruction. The source of the whistle was purely mechanical. The F4U Corsairs oil coolers were positioned in the wing roots, between the fuselage and the wing. When the aircraft flew at high speed, air rushing through these cooling passages created a distinctive, high-pitched sound. At diving speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour, the sound became an unmistakable shriek. Japanese soldiers and sailors learned to recognize the sound and interpret it as a warning of imminent danger. The psychological impact of this sound was substantial and well documented in post-war interrogations of Japanese personnel. A Japanese anti-aircraft gunner described the experience of hearing the whistle as the most terrifying moment of his war service. The combination of the sound and the knowledge that Corsairs were approaching created a panic response in troops that had learned the consequences of air attack. The whistling became associated with death and destruction. It became a symbol of American air superiority. Japanese cultural observers and military psychologists noted that the psychological impact was as significant as the physical impact of the Corsairs' weapons. The sound itself became a weapon that struck fear into the hearts of ground personnel who could not fight back. Japanese military command began to issue guidance to troops on how to psychologically manage the experience of hearing the whistle. The guidance was largely ineffective. Fear of the whistle became endemic in Japanese units operating in areas where Corsairs were active. The Japanese Navy attempted to develop countermeasures. Some aircraft were fitted with baffles intended to reduce the noise of their engines. These modifications had minimal effect on the Corsairs' distinctive sound. Some thought was given to the possibility of developing an aircraft that could match the Corsairs' speed and firepower. The Nakajima Ki-84, a new Japanese fighter that entered service in late 1943, was faster than earlier Japanese fighters, but it still could not match the Corsair in climbing speed at altitude. It was still vulnerable to the slashing diving attacks that Corsair pilots had perfected. The psychological dimension of air superiority became increasingly recognized by American commanders. The Corsair was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of American industrial might. The whistle was more than a sound. It was a reminder that the Americans possessed weapons and technology that the Japanese could not match. In the context of modern industrial warfare, such psychological advantages compound the physical advantages. A soldier who is terrified fights with less effectiveness than a soldier who is confident. A pilot who is demoralized is more vulnerable to enemy action than a pilot who believes in his aircraft. The Corsair, through its distinctive sound and its undeniable combat record, was winning battles at the psychological level even before firing a shot. By the end of 1943, the Corsair had become dominant in the air war over the Solomon Islands. The transition from American defensive posture to American offensive posture was complete. American pilots now flew with confidence. Japanese pilots flew with fear. The mathematics of the situation had become clear to all participants. The American fighter was superior. The American pilots, trained and equipped with superior aircraft, were overwhelming Japanese opposition. The outcome was no longer in doubt. The only question was how long it would take and at what cost. The Industrial Crucible. January 1944. Production facilities across the United States were operating at maximum capacity. The Corsair had proven itself in combat. Demand for the aircraft exceeded supply. Chance Vaught's facility in Stratford, Connecticut, was producing Corsairs as fast as the assembly line could move. Goodyear Aircraft, manufacturing the FG-1 variant in Akron, Ohio, was operating at full capacity. Brewster Aeronautical in Johnsville, Pennsylvania, was producing the F-3A variant, though with quality control issues that periodically shut down portions of the production line. The numbers tell the story of American industrial capacity. In 1943, total American aircraft production was approximately 25,000 combat aircraft. German production was approximately 15,000. Japanese production was approximately 20,000. The Americans, despite starting later in the conflict, had already surpassed the Axis powers in production volume. By 1944, American production would exceed 30,000 aircraft per year. The disparity was growing, not shrinking. The Corsair production numbers reflected this larger dynamic. 4,000 Corsairs had been produced by the end of 1943. By the end of 1944, production would reach 8,000 aircraft. By the end of the war in 1945, production would exceed 12,500 aircraft. These numbers represented an industrial commitment on a scale that Japan and Germany could not match. For every Corsair shot down in combat, another was rolling off the assembly line to replace it. For every pilot killed, another pilot was graduating from the training pipeline. Japanese observers understood the implications of these production numbers. Intelligence reports from Japanese military attachés in neutral countries described American industrial capacity with growing despair. The reports noted that American factories were operating continuously, that worker productivity was increasing, that new aircraft designs were entering production even as current designs continued to be built. The reports concluded that Japan faced an enemy with unlimited resources. The mathematical conclusion was inevitable. Japan could not win a war of attrition against such an enemy. But the war continued. Japanese military leaders, understanding the mathematics, but unable to reconcile those mathematics with their cultural commitment to fighting until victory or death, continued to pour resources into aircraft production and pilot training. The effort was heroic, but futile. Japan produced approximately 30,000 aircraft during 1944. The United States produced approximately 80,000. The disparity was staggering. The outcome was mathematically predetermined. The Corsair represented the cutting edge of American industrial commitment. Every Corsair that rolled off the assembly line represented the commitment of American workers, American engineers, American factories to the war effort. Every Corsair that arrived in the Pacific Theater represented American will and American industrial might. To Japanese pilots encountering Corsairs in combat, the aircraft represented a confrontation with an enemy that possessed unlimited resources and unlimited will. The psychological impact was as significant as the tactical impact. By early 1944, the integration of the Corsair into American Pacific air operations was complete. Every Marine fighter squadron in the theater had Corsairs. Many Navy squadrons were receiving them as well, though the Navy continued to favor the Hellcat for carrier operations. The technical and tactical superiority of the Corsair was accepted across the Air Force. The question was no longer whether the Corsair was superior, that was established fact, but rather how quickly the superior aircraft could be deployed to overwhelm Japanese air opposition. The revelation of victory inevitable. February 1944. The first anniversary of the Corsair's combat debut. VMF 124, the squadron that had first flown Corsairs into combat over Guadalcanal, had been withdrawn from frontline operations for rest and retraining. The pilots were assessed for their experiences. The data was compiled. The results were analyzed. The statistics were stark and undeniable. In the first year of combat operations, Corsair squadrons had destroyed more than 2,000 Japanese aircraft. The losses to Corsairs themselves numbered only around 180. The kill ratio was 11-1. Against the Zero specifically, the kill ratio was 12-1. Against Japanese bombers, the kill ratio was even more skewed. The Corsair was proving to be the most effective American fighter in the Pacific War. But the statistics only told part of the story. The real revelation was not the accuracy of the kill numbers, impressive though they were. The real revelation was the transformation in the nature of air combat. At the beginning of 1943, American pilots had been fighting a defensive war. They had been struggling to prevent Japanese air superiority from overwhelming their position. By February 1944, American pilots were conducting offensive operations across the Pacific. They were seeking out Japanese aircraft and destroying them on American terms. They were dominating the air in ways that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. Japanese military planners recognized the revelation as well. Intelligence reports from Japanese high command noted that American air superiority was now absolute. Reports indicated that Japanese aircraft were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced. Reports noted that pilot casualties were mounting at unsustainable rates. Reports concluded that Japan was losing the air war and that the outcome was no longer in doubt. But even in the face of these clear conclusions, Japanese military leadership continued to pursue the war. This was the central tragedy of the later Pacific War. The Japanese understood with mathematical clarity that they could not prevail. They understood that American industrial capacity was overwhelming. They understood that American pilots, flying superior aircraft like the Corsair, could not be defeated in the air. Yet they continued to fight. They continued to manufacture aircraft. They continued to train pilots. They continued to send those pilots to die in combat against Americans who held overwhelming advantages. The Corsair, in its operational service from February 1943 through September 1945, flew 64,051 combat sorties. It delivered 15,621 tons of bombs to Japanese positions. It destroyed 2,140 enemy aircraft in air combat. It achieved these results while suffering only 189 aircraft lost to enemy action in aerial combat. No American fighter in the Pacific War achieved a more impressive combat record. No American fighter was feared by the Japanese more than the Corsair. The revelation of American victory had come not as a sudden shock in a single engagement or campaign. It had come gradually through the accumulation of engagements, the statistics of combat, the mathematics of industrial production, and replacement rates. By February 1944, the revelation was complete. Every officer in the Japanese military who cared to examine the facts understood that Japan would not prevail. The Corsair, with its distinctive whistle and its undeniable superiority in combat, had become the symbol of that inevitable defeat. The echo of victory. August 1945. The war was ending. Japan, recognizing the impossibility of victory in the face of American industrial and military power, announced its surrender. The Pacific Campaign, which had lasted nearly 4 years, was over. The Corsair squadrons, having fought from Guadalcanal through the Solomon Islands, through New Guinea and the Philippines, through Iwo Jima and Okinawa, stood at the edge of victory. The final months of the war had seen Corsairs employed in increasingly diversified roles. Fighter bombers carrying rockets and bombs, attacking Japanese airfields and installations. Interceptors defending against Japanese suicide attacks. Escort fighters protecting transport aircraft and bomber formations. The Corsair had proven itself capable of performing every role asked of it. The aircraft that had initially been viewed with skepticism by Navy carriers and delayed in production had become the most versatile and effective fighter in the American arsenal. The 12,571 Corsairs, produced during and after the war, represented a commitment by American industry that no other power could match. The aircraft would serve in the post-war American military for another decade. Variants of the Corsair would fly in Korea, would serve as training aircraft, would serve in reserve units. The design was so fundamentally sound that it would remain in service for years after the war's conclusion. The Corsair had not just won the war. It had survived the war and persisted beyond it. Japanese pilots who survived the war were interrogated extensively by American military intelligence. When asked about their fears, their concerns, the aircraft they most dreaded encountering, the response was consistent. The Corsair, the blue fighter with the distinctive whistle, the aircraft that could not be outrun, that could not be outturned at high altitude, that could not be defeated in combat by any Japanese aircraft. The psychological impact persisted even after the war's conclusion. The Corsair had become the symbol of American air superiority, a symbol forged in combat and proven beyond any doubt. The Corsair's legacy in the post-war period was equally significant. The design principles that had made the Corsair successful, the emphasis on high speed, on high-altitude performance, on powerful armament, became foundational to post-war fighter development. Supersonic aircraft would carry forward these principles. The idea that a fighter should dominate its opponent through speed and altitude advantage, then attack from a position of superiority, would define fighter tactics for decades. The mathematics of defeat that the Corsair had imposed on the Japanese military would echo through military thinking. The recognition that industrial capacity, when properly deployed, could overcome any tactical or technical deficit had become self-evident through the war's conclusion. American industry had produced more aircraft, more pilots, better aircraft than the Japanese. The Corsair, in particular, had demonstrated that American aircraft could not just match Japanese aircraft in combat, but could dominate them comprehensively. The message was clear. Industrial capacity, in the age of industrial warfare, determines victory. The whistle of the Corsair is silent now. The aircraft that once terrified Japanese pilots and ground troops has been consigned to history. But the lesson persists. When one side possesses overwhelming industrial capacity, when that capacity is converted into superior weapons flown by trained pilots, the outcome becomes mathematically inevitable. The Corsair proved this lesson through its combat record. The aircraft that Japanese pilots feared more than any other American fighter was feared not because of any supernatural quality, but because it represented the naked fact of American industrial supremacy. And in the context of industrial warfare, that supremacy was